Welcome to our criterion referenced assessment application activity. In the next couple slides, you'll see an example of what we're kind of hoping for with this application activity. For the application activity, we would like you to take some time and review some of the standards and identify at least 2 standards that apply to the populations that you serve. If you only have time for one standard, that's totally okay. Copy and paste that standard into your learning log. Take a screenshot, use your snipping tool, whatever works best for you. Then reflect on those standards from that criterion reference lens. Think about what criterion reference tools do you have to assess student progress towards those standards. Reflect on that, briefly describe your tools, and think about how they support you in assessing student progress towards those standards. Or, once you have those standards picked out and you're trying to reflect on tools that you use, you might think that this is an area that maybe you're missing some tools in, that you don't have a lot of tools to really assess those standards that could be really important for students on your caseload. Reflect on that. Briefly describe what you feel might be helpful and assist you in assessing that student progress towards those standards. And as you're working through this reflection, consider multiple lenses. We know that not all of you do a lot of assessments, so think about your role and try to think about this activity from multiple perspectives, whether it's initial evaluations, re-evaluations, or even that IEP lens. If you don't do as many evaluations, you can view this from that IEP perspective. Do what makes the most sense for you. If you are looking at it from that IEP lens, think about what could you do or what do you already do when you're preparing for those annual IEP meetings to really determine if your student is progressing towards, that 1 or 2 standard that you picked out to reflect upon. If you're an SLP that services a lot of secondary students, we suggest reviewing the academic standards and possibly the social emotional learning competencies. Let's say that I have quite a few students on my caseload with language needs. I find that I'm commonly supporting vocabulary. So I'm going to go to the ELA, those English Language Arts standards, and specifically language. And under language, vocabulary acquisition and use is one of those kind of substandards. And so sometimes I find it helpful to kind of view those standards through that spectrum. And I might look at some of the grades below, look at the current grade of my student, and then look above. And sometimes that helps me to kind of understand what they should have been already doing, what they are expected to do right now, and then what's coming, because sometimes these standards can be a bit vague or possibly broad. And so that viewing them through this lens really helps me. And so let's say that I have a 6th or 7th grader that I'm looking at. We're trying to determine if they still need my support. I might be on as a related service. I might be on as a primary. So we're trying to figure out at this reevaluation what's still needed from that SLP perspective. And so when I look at that language standard, I can see that for both 7th and 8th grade, they need to determine and clarify the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words or phrases in grade level reading and content. They need to be able to use context clues and analyze meaningful word parts and reference, materials as needed. And then if I look at kind of the A and B, I can see that they're pretty similar between 6th and 7th grade. And I can also see that, they should be using those Greek or Latin affixes and roots as clues to the meanings of words. And so one thing that I would do is I would often ask those grade level teachers, do you have a specific list of vocabulary words that you want your students to know, to be able to use? And I would kind of look at it from that tier 2 vocabulary lens. And then I might also ask, do you have a set of, affixes and roots that you are really expecting your students to utilize? And if they don't, that's okay. You can often find kind of a reference sheet online as well. And so you can do a simple Google search and kind of look at, what are some expected 6th and 7th grade tier 2 words? What are some 6th and 7th grade maybe affixes and roots that they should be able to know? And maybe you use that as a starting point. If your teachers or maybe the curriculum that they're utilizing has some sort of assessment, you can certainly see if the teacher can provide that information, or maybe you can pull from aspects of it to look at where your student might be.
But I do recognize that at times it may not be feasible to get that information from the curriculum from your teachers due to various reasons. So one free tool that we have at our fingertips is this resource from Cubed from that Language Dynamics group. And again, it's freely available. You can download it at their website. And they did recently add some higher grade level information that we can utilize. So as you can see, there is a reading passage that you would have your student read, and I think they have some guidelines for, what level of support you can and can't provide. Then you can go through, you can look at it from more of a narrative language lens and have them do some retelling. You can have them answer some questions. You can look at the complexity of their language. But when I think back to that standard, it was vocabulary use and acquisition. So what's nice about this assessment here is that it does have some good information to provide about how that student does with inferential vocabulary and inferential reasoning. So right here, I can see how does my student do with some of those context clues. And that directly relates to that standard. Yes, it might only be touching on a small portion of that standard, but it's at least a starting point, and it's using one type of assessment that I can use to see how the student is doing with this skill, and maybe I can get into the classroom to do an observation. Maybe there are some curricular pieces I can grab from the teacher, or maybe some good assessments from the classroom that also kind of complement this. But this is just one way, one starting point that you could use to possibly assess that vocabulary standard. So in my learning log, I'm going to copy over that vocabulary standard for 6th or 7th grade, whichever one I want to really focus on. I'm going to do some reflection about how I have this assessment. Maybe I haven't really utilized it much. And so in my reflection, I'm going to talk about how I've been aware of this. I really want to use it. Or maybe I find I don't know if this is the best choice for me. And so in my reflection, in my learning log, I might comment on how I would really like to learn a little bit more about the curriculum and the curricular vocabulary. And so one way I might do that is by connecting with a teacher. Let's say that I have a science teacher that I have a really good relationship with. I'm going to go to them and see, do you have a list of tier 2 words? Do you have a list of affixes and roots that I could pull from to see where my 6th or 7th grade student should be? And so that's my reflection. I've got my standards, I've thought about tools that I use or that I wish I could use, and I've done some reflection around that.
As our students shift from middle school to high school, we know that there can continue to be some language and social communication needs. So we're going to give one more example of some standards we could look at. A standard that I might start with, just like that other example, is the speaking and listening standards. Let's say that I am working with a 9th or 10th grader. I can see that, again, they need to be initiating and participating effectively in collaborative discussions, and that continues into 11th and 12th grade. I continue to look down the speaking and listening standards for 9th and 10th grade as well as 11th and 12th. I can see they need to be understanding and evaluating a speaker's point of view and reasoning. They also need to be presenting their own information, findings, and evidence in a way that is organized and sequential. Again, a strategy that I like to use is to look at the current grades, so 9th and 10th there in the middle, look at the grade below and look at the grades above, just so I can see what's changing between these standards. And if we look back to 8th grade, we can see that they're engaging effectively in those collaborative discussions, building on and expressing their ideas clearly. Then if we shift into 9th and 10th grade, now they need to initiate and participate effectively in those discussions, as well as listen actively. And that continues into 11th and 12th grade. And then if I look at kind of those substandards, those ABCs, I can see that in 8th grade, again, set and track norms. Now in 9th and 10th grade, they need to work with peers to set those norms and take votes on them. They need to monitor their own progress in 8th grade. And now in 9th and 10th, they need to reflect on that progress as an individual as well as a group. Going back to 8th grade, pose questions that connect ideas and comment with relevant evidence and observations, promote multiple perspectives. And then in 9th and 10th grade, we see they need to clarify, verify, and challenge ideas, promote multiple perspectives as well as divergent perspectives, and then engage with those diverse perspectives, summarize those agreements and disagreements, and make new connections. And then if you just glance over at 11th and 12th, you can see the expectations increase even more. So it can be really helpful to ground yourself. If I'm working with a 9th, 10th grade student, I can kind of see where should they have come from, where should they be now, and it can be helpful in thinking about where my student might be at. So when I think back to that standard, it contains a lot of information and it can be very overwhelming and challenging to think about how do we even begin to assess something like that. One tool that is out there and freely available on the SALT website is the SALT Persuasion Elicitation Protocol and the corresponding rubric. And what that protocol does is it helps you to collect a persuasion sample. So you work with the child and say, I want to find out how well you can persuade someone. So talking to people to change their mind to get them to do something that you want. And then you go on to provide some examples and a little bit more direction. There's a planning sheet that goes with it, so you can give the child a little bit more support. You can give them some time to plan and get them thinking to prepare them for this task. Record and have that child complete the task, and then you can use the PSS or the Persuasion Scoring Scheme rubric to go through and see how your student did. Again, they provide the characteristics you're looking at, so how well do they identify the issue and provide some supporting reasons, and then you can go through and look at it from that proficient advanced level all the way down to that minimal immature level. If you utilize something like that persuasion protocol and that rubric, then you can go to this table that's in an article that John and his colleagues wrote, and we'll have it posted on our Google Drive for you. And you can look at how did my student do compared to other students. We can use it as that criterion referenced assessment. And so they have the grade level listed over here on the left. If we shift over to the right, we can see that PSS or that persuasion scoring scheme, and we can look down to 10th grade. On average, students were scoring about 22 points on that rubric, plus or minus 4 for that standard deviation, so about 18 to 26 would be considered within that average or typical range. And again, I can use this as just one small part of my evaluation. I can look at how does this student do maybe within the classroom, within some observations with some teacher report. I can see, okay, when they have more of a one-on-one type of setting, do they have the language? Can they work through this? Can they take multiple perspectives? Can they try to persuade someone to do something? And then put it in that broader context of how does this show up in the classroom? What does this look like functionally? We hope that with our persuasive example, you might see how it can give us some information into social communication. If we look across some of the different standard areas, we can see that persuasive discourse is really across multiple subject areas, so it can be a really high mileage skill to assess, as well as support if it comes out as a need. We can also make connections to social communication by doing some of this persuasive protocol along with teacher interviews and student interviews, information from the family, and then complementing all of these things with observations. We can really get a good look at how our students are engaging in those collaborative discussions, and we can also think about, is this a communication difference? Is it some sort of social communication skill that might be lacking? Is there an accommodation that could support this student, or does the teacher need some support and coaching in how to better engage with this student? When I think back to when I was working in middle school and working with one student who is autistic, they didn't really struggle with perspective taking, but they shared with me that they didn't really feel a need to share their thoughts, especially if their thoughts were different from the group and it could produce some conflict. They really wanted to avoid conflict at all costs. So when we started talking a little bit more about discourse in the classroom, productive conflict, and then expectations that might be present in a certain class, that student really gained a clear understanding of how it can be important to share their perspectives and how we can really engage in sharing of different perspectives, even if some conflict arises. We know that you might be questioning or wondering why we didn't provide a more social communication based example or specifically mention the social emotional learning competencies. As John and I were planning for this module, we experienced what you often experience in the schools and what I remember experience while I worked at secondary: overwhelm, thinking, where do I even start? We know SLPs want examples they can put into practice and usable materials, so we tried to do that by starting with the academic standards that are a bit more straightforward and that we felt maybe you could make some connections to social communication. We know social communication is a common area that we assess and support at secondary. We know it can be complicated and complex to assess. We also know there can be conflicting information about how to assess it, how to provide supports, who provides supports. We know there's many different attitudes and perspectives towards social communication and neurodiversity. Our field has a lot of learning and growing to do as we try to approach therapy from a neurodiversity affirming lens. I relate to these challenges and I understand these challenges. When I was working in middle school, this was a constant daily reflection and challenge at times. We don't have the magic answer, but we hope that with that persuasive example, it can serve as a small starting point that could be used in conjunction with other assessments like observation, teacher, family, student interviews, as well as dynamic assessment. So we encourage you to choose 1 to 2 standards to reflect upon for the application activity. Feel free to use the standards or examples that I provided, especially if this feels maybe overwhelming or uncomfortable for you. Think about tools that you have, that you use, and you could even reflect upon how you want to try out something like that persuasive protocol and rubric. Do what works best for you. We also encourage you to briefly review some of those social emotional learning competencies if you're interested. We think that this could lead to some really great discussions during some of our upcoming community of practice meetings, and we would love to learn more from you and hear your perspectives on how those competencies may provide some insight into assessment.
If you have a great system in place where you're pairing high quality criterion referenced assessments with the standards, we would love to learn more about it from you. We know from talking with district leadership teams that there are inconsistencies in this area, so your colleagues as well as us would love to hear what you're doing. So feel free to email me any resources that maybe you're willing to share so that we can start to build a set of criterion referenced assessment resources that all SLPs might benefit from. One final reminder, if you haven't already, please fill out that module completion survey. And if you have any questions or need support, please reach out. And we hope that you have a good rest of your day.